everyone, and welcome to 5 Steps to Perfecting Your Post-Award Grants Management Process with Rachel Werner. This workshop is being recorded and slides will be shared afterwards, so please keep your eyes peeled for a follow-up email later in case you want to review anything from today. In case this is your first time here, this free grant workshop is brought to you by Instrumentl. These collaborations are with different community partners to provide free educational opportunities for grant professionals. Our goal is to tackle some sort of problem that you folks often have to solve for while sharing the different ways that Instrumentl's platform can also help grant writers win more grants. Instrumentl is the institutional fundraising platform. If you want to bring grant prospecting, tracking, and management into one place, we can help you do that. And you can use the link that I'll put in the Zoom chat in a little bit in the case where you want to try us out. Lastly, be sure to stick around for today's entire presentation. At the end, we'll be sharing some extra resources, more details to come on that after Rachel's presentation. With that housekeeping out of the way, I'm really excited to bring back to our stage Rachel Werner. She's the owner and CEO of RBW Strategy. She served as a nonprofit fundraiser, grant writer, grants manager at an education management organization, and management consultant overseeing federal government contracts. Since the beginning of her career, her firm has helped secure over $40 million in funding from government, foundation, and corporate sources, and managed over $2 billion in grant funding. She's an active member of the Grant Professionals Association and Association of Fundraising Professionals, and regularly conducts in-person and online trainings at national and local conferences. Some of her favorite things to do favorite parts about this work is learning about the causes and missions that help communities all over the world and how little steps can make a huge difference. So it's a privilege to help organizations fulfill their missions while enhancing her perspective on critical issues and causes. We ask that if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please include 3 hashtags in front of that in order to make it easier to stand out in the Zoom chat. Other than that, Rachel, feel free to take it away.
Thanks, Will. Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for taking the time to talk about all things grants management. Now, this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, especially with a lot of the government grant funding that's been coming down the pike. So really, we're just trying to look at this in a way to make it more manageable for you, because a lot of times we focus on the pre-award and all of the steps involved with that, which are critical, the research and the planning and all of the application writing and cultivation. All of that is incredibly important. And then what I want to see is sort of that translation to the post-award side, because a lot of times there isn't as much of that focus on post-award management and compliance. And so I'm here to kind of bring up some things and see how we can, sort of learn some new tips that could help you as you start to dig into this work a little bit more, or perhaps, gain some things that you can bring back to your organizations. So I think that we already had people starting to share their information in the chat, so thank you. It was really great to see a wonderful representation of folks from all over the country. And, Will already gave me an introduction, so I'm not really going to go into detail about, my introduction. I'm based in the DC area, so if you're there, hello. And, we primarily work with clients, started out in the DC area, but now we've expanded to across the country. And one of the things that we've really started to also focus on is post-award management. So let's talk about what we're going to be reviewing today. So I think of compliance as sort of the broccoli of the grants work, because a lot of people don't really want to talk about compliance and policies and reporting and all of those things, but they're sort of an important component if you want to keep that grant funding and sustain it for the future years. I think that it can be a lot more fun to talk about those applications and going after new funding sources, new projects, and really looking into these new relationships that you can develop and building out existing relationships with funders. But this is also a critical component. So what we're going to do is talk about the importance of post-award management and how we can use research tools like Instrumentl and other research strategies to learn about post-award needs and how you can think about that from pre-award as you're starting to pursue opportunities. And then we're going to go into the top 5 tips to manage your grants, and then going to have some review and reflections to kind of talk about what we learn. And I think that, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of focus on pre-award. So this is sort of shifting our thinking of how do we take some of the skills and the tools that we use in pre-award and apply them in post-award. And that's really what this is about. So first of all, why is grants management so important? And this is sort of a question that I'm posing, and I'd love to, maybe Will, you can call out things from the chat box, but what do funders want to see regarding their grant award? So if you are requesting funding from a foundation, from a government funder, from a corporate entity, what do you think they want to see regarding their grant awards? What is it that you think is important for them? And so, Will, you can start, sharing anything that people have shared.
Yeah, absolutely. One person mentioned impact. Stacy mentioned how we're going to measure success and report on outcomes. Julia talked about relevance and proven management. Mary's talked about demonstrated need, contract adherence from Colleen, as well as Anna mentioning meeting deliverables and a few other things here.
Great. Well, those are all wonderful answers. And I know that those are all very much top of mind for funders, and depending on the funder type, some more than others. But the answer is knowing that their funding makes a difference. And I think all of the things that you shared is part of that. They want to see how are you as an organization implementing their priorities, their interests, and making an impact into how they're directing their resources towards the support of a larger issue or cause or initiative. So thinking about, target groups or causes that need additional resources that could be based on a certain target population, certain geographic area. Also thinking about the community aspect, especially for a lot of those local funders, community foundations, and so forth, and thinking about how that could be a really critical component to building those more viable communities that can really help preserve the fabric of that area. And also thinking about ways, especially now, we're focused on a lot of DEIA initiatives, and thinking about how does that contribute to the more equitable, inclusive society that we're working towards. And funders are thinking about this across the sector. So all of your answers kind of fall into this, and sort of thinking about also just the backbone of the organizations, how to strengthen them so they can do great work, and so that you can continue to do the great work. And that's really what the point of post-award compliance is. I'm going to keep kind of trying to take it back to that, is that it's really trying to make sure that you can continue providing great services, support, and just contributing to the impact of people that you serve or the causes that you support. So why is it important? So if your organization does not report on our outcomes or provide enough information on progress to your funders, you may not receive additional funding in the future. So it's important to really contribute to that story and contributing to that cultivation strategy. That's a huge component of building that relationship with funders, because you want to make sure that everything that you put in that application is adhered to. And if it's not, how are you making those pivots? How are you explaining that to funders? Because, as some people mentioned before, the reports and outcomes story and the data is really critical to sharing your story. We know that there are challenges. We know that things have changed, especially in the past 3 years, but how are you conveying that? How are you reporting on that to funders? And also connecting with grant makers and making sure that you continue providing that sort of story to them throughout the course of the life cycle, and making sure that you maintain that information on file and can share that as needed for all different areas, either financial, regarding your budget, operations, any sort of administrative information that needs to be, or emails, and programmatic, of course, which is your data, your activities, your outcomes, and any sort of stories or testimonials that would be important to share. And this is something that I generally use on presentations, because all of the grants related work kind of fits into this life cycle. So we know the importance of research and strategic planning. I think that probably is the most important component of the grants life cycle, because it sets the stage for how you do all of the other work. And the other one that I'm really going to be focusing on is 4, which is award management and monitoring. And that's really, to me, almost the second most important component, because that's what you do to sustain that grant throughout the life cycle, throughout the work that you're doing with that funder. And so how are you sort of setting that tone with funders? And, just in terms of, what this means from an organizational perspective, is that when you think about grants management, and I really like this description. So grants management is a process and methods organizations go through to oversee grants from operations, financial, and programmatic vantage. So it encompasses every part of a grant's life cycle from pre-research to post-award closeout. So even though the award management and monitoring is a specific phase, the whole focus of grants management, you have to kind of think about it across the life cycle. So it's really important to kind of think about it throughout the whole process. And as you're looking at opportunities, determining if they're the right fit, because you're going to have to manage that funding. I've actually had clients decide not to pursue additional funding because of the additional post-award requirements that were needed for them to continue with that. And so the other thing I want to quickly mention is that government, if you are a recipient of government funding, then you probably are aware of 2 CFR 200, which is the Uniform Grant Guidance under the Office of Management and Budget. So that's really the federal grant requirements, and it's required of if you're a recipient of state, local, or federal grant funding, and that is what you must adhere to. So in order to make sure that you continue to be a good steward, you need to make sure that you understand 2 CFR 200 and understand its components. That could be a whole other presentation, so I'm not going to dive into it too much, but happy to answer questions if you wanted to, email me about that. And I know that it's so easy to be overwhelmed when you administer a grant. So just trying to focus on the things that are high priority, things that you can build upon that you're already doing within your organization that can make you continue with your success. So I'm curious, and this is another chat question, what are your biggest challenges related to grants management? What do you see as the greatest barriers to success, or things that you might need additional help on? So I'll defer to you, Will, to call out the responses.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple references to technology, report scheduling and upkeep are some other responses so far. Coordination with the team, staying on top of deadlines and requirements of reporting, entering data and monitoring, reporting deadlines and a lot of reporting deadlines and upkeep. And navigating all the different funder portals. That's a good one. And upkeep of grant tracker and results data from internal teams, different stakeholders.
Ah, gosh, I heard a lot of reporting, because a lot of it just seems like the administravia around grants management, which I know can be a lot. So, and Will's going to probably share a little bit more about, how you might be able to better manage this. But, and a lot of it just depends on the capacity of your organization, what you'll be able to manage, from a financial perspective, and also just from personnel perspective on who's owning the system. We're going to get into a little bit of the tracking later, but thank you for sharing. And so the part 2 is really, how can I leverage research? So when going back and thinking about that grants life cycle and thinking about the first part, which is the planning and research. So thinking about that, and how can I start thinking about post-award and grants management at that particular phase? And so one of the things that, I like to do is try to think through, kind of be a little detective, so what are the things that you want to gather during the research process? Some things to think about are there multiple application cycles for this opportunity or for this funder? Because if you're looking at it from a reporting perspective, if you can apply to this funder at a different time in the year, will that sort of ease your burden post-award? Because if you know that they might administer the award 3 months after submit the application, is that going to be a burden for you? Because I know that for the work that we do with clients, it tends to be either December or the end of the fiscal year, which could be in June. And so there's certain times of year that seem to be more busy than others. So are there things that you can sort of plan out in your calendar? And also thinking about the application. So looking at the application, are they requiring a great deal of information? And thinking about, can I report on these? Do we have the capacity to gather this information and these data, those outcomes and so forth? Can you report on them accurately? And also financial, because we know that if they ask for a lot of different breakouts of budget and how you're spending your funds, and thinking about, do you have the capacity to report on those? And also thinking about it from an outreach perspective. Are there going to be requirements for you to incorporate their award and progress into your existing social media digital marketing campaigns? Is that something that you need to integrate? And also thinking about how responsive they are. So if you have the ability to connect with them, and you're able to have a conversation with them, you might be able to find some more details, before you actually apply, so that you can maybe even avoid an opportunity that in the end might not be a good fit. So thinking about what you can look at from a research perspective. And so here's a couple things that I like to think, again, thinking about the application as a treasure hunt. So when you're thinking about post-award support, here's some questions that are common in applications, and here's what they're really trying to ask. Here's the information funders are trying to gather. So what successful outcomes does the organization anticipate for this fund, for its use of funding from this particular organization? So they want to have assurance of the impact. And I know that this was referenced before. So they want to know how your clients or the people that you serve are impacted by the program, and what activities are really driving change. And also thinking about how you define success and how you're going to incorporate that into the metrics to determine whether or not you're successful against those activities. And then another one is, sustainment, because I know that that's a lot of concern for organizations, especially as you're thinking about renewal funding and thinking about if they're going to continue to invest in you, how is that going to be leveraged within the organization? So thinking about the other sources of funding and your overall strategy for seeking additional support and other revenue that you're bringing in. So those are the kind of things to think about when you're putting together your applications that they're going to be asking about post-award, and probably in the reports as well. And so with that, I'm going to defer to Will to talk through how Instrumentl can be used for this kind of research.
Awesome. So one of the things that you're often going to want to look into is you're going to want to look into digging into different funder profiles, looking into the sort of folks that they have been funding in the past, as well as looking into just their funder websites as well. So if you are looking to bring some of the management components back into your work, what you'll see in Instrumentl is that, let me know once you see my screen, what you'll see is you'll essentially see a dedicated tracker for each of your projects. And within these trackers, some of the folks were mentioning some of the challenge points of post-award grant management is keeping everybody in the same loop, getting other stakeholders involved with the process. And that's what you can do once you start to save things into your tracker. You're going to have different dedicated workspaces for each of your respective fundraising initiatives. And then you'll be able to add different tasks for the team members that are responsible for different components of the process. So we cover things from the start of the process to the latter half of the life cycle that Rachel shared in that graphic a couple slides ago. What you'd be able to do is, if, for example, somebody on your team is responsible for reporting in some sort of way, then you could schedule that sort of task to that person. And then from there, set a due date for when they need to tackle that by. Say it's next Thursday, and then also set who might be collaborating with them on that certain thing. And then once a week, once that happens, you would be able to get notified of those upcoming tasks related to the grants that you're looking to track or manage towards. The other thing you can do is see all the information about the funder in the same place as well. So when you dig into these funder tabs, you'll see where those opportunities exist in your different trackers. You'll see that I have these not only in my environmental project, but also in my STEM education project, since this is a general operational support grant. And then as I scroll down through here as well, this is where you can really start digging into the funder as well. You can give them a quick phone call. Maybe you already have an existing relationship and you want to catch up with that funder. Maybe you want to just access that funder's direct website. From here, what we can do is we can dig into that side of things. So one of the earlier comments was on all the different funder portals. Well, it can just be useful to have everything in one place, because whether that's you using the notes section on the right-hand side, as you can see here, I've kind of included a note of what they're proud to support. You can also just dig into their actual, background information of who they're funding the most. So things like the giving averages and medians, or if you're on our standard plan or above, you'll see things that are unique to Instrumentl, like the openness to new grantees. And knowing the difference between these sorts of things can make it so much easier to prioritize which relationships to cultivate the most in the next sort of section of your life cycle, as well as just to organize everything into a central source of truth. And I know that's something that some folks are probably thinking about is, what about the grant opportunities from outside Instrumentl that I don't find? Well, in that situation, what you can do is you can also add new and then upload many. And here you can just download our template where once you bring this into Instrumentl, you'll have your existing opportunities also in the central source of truth. And so that makes it so that everybody can just stay on the same page a lot faster. Because once you set up a couple projects on Instrumentl, you're going to have what we call a master tracker. And that's where you really start to see how all of this comes together, in which if I have 5 to 10 different fundraising opportunities that I'm pursuing, I see it all in one place. If you're on our standard planner above, you'll start to have a master calendar view. And now everything is kind of organized, tidied up in the same place as well. Now, there's a couple questions that I'll answer quickly before passing it back to you, Rachel. But Teresa's asking to assign tasks to staff. Do they need to have an Instrumentl login or account? They do. And if you want to add them to your account, you go to that bottom left corner under account and then go to manage team. The other thing you can do is maybe you have a team member who's like a volunteer in your organization and they're not necessarily going to need Instrumentl every single day. Another thing you can do is when you're in these funders, a lesser known sort of feature that folks do is they share this grant with their team members this way, and this will just send a direct email to that respective funder profile as well. And so that can be super useful as well. All of our base plans, to answer your question, Diana, support starting out 3 users, but if you want to add an additional user, it's $5 per month per additional user. Everett asked the question of if we integrate with any CRMs like Monday.com. We actually do integrate directly with Salesforce right now. And so if you're looking for that sort of feature and whatnot, when you're creating your free account on Instrumentl, let our team know, and we can definitely share more about how our Salesforce integration works. And we're working on some other integrations in the future as well. But yeah, that should go over some of the fundamentals in terms of the tracking side of things and the management that you might be able to bring into one place, along with some of the funder research that you were referencing.
Great. Okay, let me go back to sharing my screen. Okay, great. All right, so we've just gone through the demo, so I'm just gonna flip past here and get to another chat question. So how would you rate your organization's grants management processes on a scale of 1 to 10? I'd love to know this because we're going to get to the tips now. So I'm curious to see how people are thinking. So Will, what are you seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. I am seeing a wide range of numbers, actually. I'll read it from the start. 3, 5, 8.5, 5, 4, 7, 4, 8, 5, 7, 6, 6, 6, 5, 3. I feel like I'm reading a phone number right now.
Yeah,
7, 3, 5,
6, 7, 5, 3, 0, 9, and
7, 6, 1, 7, 0, 5, 4, 5, and 9, and 6, and 8. So anywhere it looks like lower end 0, upper end maybe an 8, but not too much beyond that.
Okay, well, you know what? I think in the middle is good, because that means that you already have some things in place, but maybe you need to kind of build that up and enhance it a little bit more. And sometimes it's a question of it becomes a situation when you receive more funding, because I know that some of our clients have received a lot of ARPA federal funding. And so they have had to develop these out of necessity, because they've had to really think about post-award management because of the greater transparency related to that. So it could be a situation where you're sort of forced to deal with compliance when, you you might not have focused on that much before. So here's my top 5 tips that I'm going to share, and I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because I do want to leave time for questions, but I do want to open the door that if you have additional questions, feel free to email me. My contact information is going to be at the end because I'm happy to discuss this. I love talking about compliance, and I'm happy to kind of share some additional thoughts. So first thing I want to talk about is your resource capacity, because I think that's really critical to determining how many grants you're able to manage. So the first thing I would suggest is really kind of conduct a needs assessment. Here's a couple of ways that you can approach it. It's the incremental approach. And that's basically trying to answer the question, what capacity would enable us to grow and move forward to meet our goals? So thinking about what it is that you're going to have to build towards in order to get to a state where you can successfully manage these grants. And the other approach is sort of the gap analysis. So sort of taking what the ideal situation is that you'd like to be in the future and comparing that to the current situation and what are the differences between them, and thinking about the difference between your current and ideal state. And I think that some of you are probably thinking about that when you're ranking at a 3. How do you get from that 3 to a 10 or even to an 8? Somewhere where you feel more comfortable with what you're doing and what you are presenting to funders. And the way that you want to think through your resources is kind of breaking it down to different areas. You have personnel, and that could be people who are staff, volunteers, or outsourced support. So anybody who's kind of there to support the process. It doesn't have to be people who are in grants and thinking about finance, programmatic, and also administrative. So thinking about how all of those people, are there sort of any weak links or areas of improvement that are needed? And also technology and systems. I know that was mentioned before. So what kind of tools that you have to kind of get through and make sure that you're able to manage the grant funding? And do you have anything that's weak? And also things like information sharing. Do you use something like Teams or Slack or some other kind of system to organize all of the information so it can be shared readily? And also the systems that you have in place to make sure that that flows for between different individuals, especially because a lot of people touch it. And then also knowledge. This is a big area because sometimes there's a knowledge gap between what people might know about post-award management and what actually is in-house. And so making sure that there's enough understanding about how you need to create that sort of opportunities for your team to know, to have the skills that they can be able to be successful in this area. And also thinking about this is going to be a little bit, more about leadership, and thinking about not just, the leadership buy-in is incredibly important because it's the top down to ensure that there's a compliance culture within your organization and making sure that there's that sort of focus on reporting and monitoring, but also how are you documenting that for purposes of making sure all the authorized individuals are established and know what their roles are, and that level of accountability, because that's important whether you receive government grants or not. It's really important to kind of have that sort of ethos, because we don't always talk about culture of philanthropy, but I think it also should be a culture of compliance, because that's what allows you to sustain the funding and make sure that you remain a viable recipient of funding from any funder. And thinking about your policy. So this is definitely focused on government funding, but this should be applied across the board. Now, the policies that you'll want to have in place are dictated by the grant awards. So it's really important to understand, their current grant agreements to make sure what you must adhere to. And thinking about those from an administrative, standpoint of what are the different individuals and roles involved, and thinking about your budget, thinking about data management, thinking about the submission and the reporting policies. How are those codified within your organization? Because that's really important to setting the tone again for that compliance culture. And if you don't have those in place, what are you doing as part of the needs assessment to figure out how you can get those in place and figuring out which policies you need to develop? So thinking through some of that will be really helpful for you, because those policies have sometimes been requested by funders, even non-governmental funders, and they don't need to be extensive. They just need to be accurate, and they need to really dictate what you're doing as an organization to ensure that you're going to be a good steward of their funding. And then here's some examples of policies. Again, these are sort of a little bit more focused on government grants, but you can kind of see how they could be incorporated into some other policies that you might be developing, like travel policy, cash management policy. Again, some of these might not be applicable, but important to, kind of think about. And this is thinking about federal funding. What this really is the COSO internal control framework, and this is part of 2 CFR 200 for developing internal controls. And this sort of outlines all of those policies I just referenced in the previous slide. It shows what are you going to do to be a good steward of that government funding. And this provides that assurance that yes, we have these controls in place that assure that we are going to minimize risk. And that's really what compliance is minimizing risk. And so then let's think about the processes. So you have your policies in place where it outlines who's responsible for what and how things are going to flow from one department or one person to another. So what are the processes? So thinking about it from 3 different vantages: administering the grant, tracking the grant, ensuring quality. So these are thinking about the systems and technology that were referenced before for the tracking and administering of the funds, the people, so having people with the right skills and ability to do this work, and also the time frame. So making sure that you can do this within the reporting deadlines and that there's certain processes in place to ensure that you're being reminded of these deadlines, and what are those processes, and that this is where the leadership buy-in is important to making sure that those are set up from the top and that's going to be followed. And these are just from 3 separate vantages to think about it from a financial perspective. It's really important on the budget reconciliation side to track all those grant related expenditures. And I would honestly definitely recommend having sort of a kickoff call post award and thinking about, what you're supposed to be doing on the award and who is supposed to be involved in the process, because that could help set the right tone. So as you're thinking about who's your financial point person, who's your programmatic point person, who's your operations point person, if you're all in the same room or a virtual room, how are you sort of getting on the same page about the deadlines and the responsibilities and managing that award? And these different lanes can really help you sort of ensure that you're on the right track. So, financials, really making sure that the budget is intact and they're coded correctly, and if people's time is reported on grants, that's going to be organized correctly in your system of record. Programmatic is making sure you're thinking about the performance measurement and how you're actually doing the work, and making sure if you are using funds that they're going to be reported to financial. And operations is sort of going to be that sort of project manager person who might be reporting to the awarding agency if there's any updates, and also just making sure that things are running smoothly and those reporting deadlines are being met. And so sometimes that person is a bridge between programmatic, financial. Sometimes that person could be financial or programmatic. So depending on the size of your organization, I understand. So it's just important to clarify the different components of the process. And this is where we get to tracking. And I'm going to bring in Will back in a second to talk about some of the tracking that needs to take place. But when you're thinking about tracking, because a lot of times people ask, well, what system should I use? How should I be tracking these grants? And I also have to track all these outcome requirements, all of these things. These are the things I want you to think about and reflect on with your team within your organization. Is more than one person tracking key deliverables? Are you going to be the one? Are you the project manager? Or are there going to be more than one people? Because that's going to be a systems and technology concern. If you're going to have more than one person, then you need to have the information in a space that's accessible. Is there a system that you already use for grants and fundraising functions? Can you leverage that for tracking? And also, how many people are involved in the process? And again, this goes back to the question of tracking the key deliverables if there's only one point person. And also the level of accountability. So if there's going to be someone who's checking, who is that person? How are they involved? And how do we kind of ensure that they're a part of the process? And also thinking about your budget, because if you don't have a lot of additional funds to spend on a separate tracking tool, trying to leverage what you already have. Because I'll say that, those responses are going to determine the system that you use. Now, I've seen all different kinds of things. I have seen grants that are managed in manual systems or databases like Excel files or Google Sheets, and they're shared in teams that are shared in other, Slack, Basecamp, you name it. I've also seen Google Sheets. So all of those things, it really depends on how you use it. Project management systems, I've seen that. So I've seen Asana, I've seen Monday, I've seen a bunch of different tools that could be used to track, and also seen grants management systems like Instrumentl, Grant Hub, and other systems. And again, it depends on how many grants you have and how many people are involved in the system. But if you're already using something like Instrumentl for your research, it seems a natural segue. And again, there's no right or wrong approach. Somebody asked me before, what's the best project management tool out there? And I said, it really just depends. You really have to figure out what are the important components for your organization, because so many of them are cloud-based and they're more cost-effective. So I think that you can find a solution that fits you if you're looking to get something that's a little bit more cloud-based or user-friendly, perhaps, than a manual spreadsheet. And so, Will, is there anything else you wanted to share about the tracking?
Yeah, the main thing that I'd say, aside from what I shared earlier on different tasks that you can create for team members, is that we also have customizable reports where, in the case where a few earlier questions are made on what about people that may not necessarily need Instrumentl every day and whatnot, but we often see our folks who will generate custom reports and then attach those for different weekly or bi-weekly team meetings. And that can be a great way to keep, whether it's your board involved or your executive director that you might be reporting to on how your grants are doing, in the loop in terms of all the different things you're working on. The biggest thing though is, like what you said, Rachel, figure out the system that works for you. What's really nice that I will say about bringing your work into something that is fully integrated like an Instrumentl is that, aside from the discovery of new opportunities you'll be getting from your matches, you're also going to get those auto reminders of tasks and deadlines all in the same place as well. And so we have a separate workshop. It's actually also free and available on demand, where we dig into different considerations when you're assessing different tech tools. And so I can definitely provide that as a follow-up resource for folks that just want to explore that further. We go through just a helpful decision matrix of like factors to consider when making that further evaluation of some of the different tools that you've outlined.
Great. All right. Thank you. Yeah, Instrumentl has a lot of great resources out there, so definitely take advantage of some of them, because I think there's a lot of things that could really help you throughout the process. And so the last thing that I want to say is my last tip is making sure that your team has the skills who are able to manage it. Now, first of all, it's really important to identify who's involved in the grants process, and that could be pre and post award. Thinking about who's involved in this, because likely the people who are involved pre-award are going to be involved post award, and determine, and this is part of the needs assessment that was reviewed in the first tip, is there a knowledge gap, and can that be filled by someone in-house, or do you need to outsource, or do you need to look into other trainings? Now, there's a lot of trainings out there on federal grants management. I've seen a lot of things on that, and there's also training on grant requirements. So if you have specific questions about resources, again, you can email me, because I know a lot out there. I just didn't want to bombard people with information that might be specific to your organization. And just thinking about what are the greatest needs. Do you need to have more on the financial management, because there's a lot of financial accounting, or programmatic, which is more evaluation, and that's a whole different area. And then also thinking about it from an administrative standpoint, which is thinking about the tracking and the management. What are the things that you need to think about to help make sure that you're up to speed and have the right resources and skills available to do the work successfully. And so the last part is really thinking about the ongoing maintenance, and thinking about, what you have in place. Is it working? Is it not working? So thinking about, the tracking, especially when we look at the protocols and the systems, what is working right now, and what's keeping you on track, what might need to be updated. And again, thinking about that reflection of what exactly are the greatest needs, and where do you want to go? And are there other priorities that need to be addressed, and thinking, or could this be part of a larger organizational initiative that you're doing to improve technology across the board? So thinking about that, and when you have meetings with your team to talk about the deliverables, are all the right people there? Is someone from finance? Is someone from programs? Someone from, it might be more than one program lead, especially for multiple grants, and also thinking about administrative. So maybe having a monthly touch point meeting to just check on, hey, how's this going? We have a report due. We need this level of information. Because I think sometimes what I've seen working with different clients, especially in those that have more siloed departments, is that there's not as much communication about where they can contribute to the reports. Are they given a schedule in advance to know when those reports are due and when information might be required? Is there a template you need to use? So those kind of things can be helpful. And especially if you had a system, like Instrumentl, to help track some of those things, then you could just tag those people and making sure that they're in the loop. Ensure that those things are updated, because sometimes especially if one person's doing it, it can be a bit tricky to have one person who's managing all the different components. But if that's their role, perhaps they're more of a project manager, then that could be systematized across the board and be part of the process. Other times, if there's other people involved, then making sure they know that they're going to be updating and tracking in the same way. And just making sure that you update your processes and policies, especially if you receive government funding, because there's always new updates from OMB and always new information from awarding agencies you just want to incorporate into the work that you're doing. So just some considerations, make sure that you focus on the top priority grant management needs. If it's going to be technology, focus on technology. If it's going to be training, then focus on that. Don't try to do everything at once, because then you're just going to be overwhelming. You're going to feel like you're not doing enough. And so it's really just part of that review of what is going to be critical, and thinking about it from a risk-based perspective, because that's what compliance is. What is going to be if you don't address something, what is that going to be the riskiest, or what is going to be the riskiest thing you can do? So I'm thinking about that and how you can minimize that risk through some of these sort of these solutions to try to make sure that you're covering the basis, and that you're not going to be slipping up on anything or missing any key deadlines, and you're not going to be in compliance. And also, just with the federal grant funding, just making sure that you're aware of any updates related to 2 CFR 200, because there's always some new things, and there's a lot of great resources out there. So if there's going to be final roadmap to kind of pull this together, and then I'll go with the key takeaways, is first one is really understanding your grants management requirements, understanding those notices of grant award, and making sure you know what the reporting requirements and any other monitoring, any other updates, and who's the point of contact, just making sure that information is available, and then determining, what kind of needs you have, updating your policies and procedures and other tracking mechanisms, and then making sure that the team has the knowledge and skills that can be trained to move forward and be able to address these areas based on the needs and updated policies and stuff. And always just part of the checking and the tracking is the continuous review to make sure that the systems are working, and if they're not, how can they be tweaked? And so my 3 learning takeaways are, identify what your organization has the capacity to manage. I think that's the number one thing. It's sort of that go, no-go assessment. When you're thinking about going after award from a pre-award perspective, look and see what the requirements are post-award. Can you manage that? Can you ensure that you can provide that information that's accurate, and that you can do that, and you have the resources able to do that work? And so just making sure that there's that sort of understanding at the beginning, and thinking about also prioritizing your grants management needs, and making sure that you can think about them in these different buckets of financial, operational, programmatic, which areas are most in need of support right now, and what are the things that you can do to build into that. And just also that it takes time. When we start working with clients on building out policies and procedures, it can take time, because some things are in different places, and also just understanding from an organizational perspective that we can put together a great policy and procedures document, but if it's not followed, then it's pretty useless. So figuring out what makes the most sense within each organization, because each one is completely different. And here's my contact information, and I will leave it to any questions that are in the hopper, because I'm happy to answer them. And in addition to that, I also have a takeaway here, so you can feel free to snag that as well. It's a logic model template that you can use, which I think are very, very important from a pre-award perspective, because that could be used for the data gathering and management for post-award. So I love a good logic model. So with that, I will defer to you, Will, to see if there's any questions I can answer.
Diana had a question of just in general, how often should folks be communicating with a funder throughout the year after a grant is received? And what sort of communication would you recommend? A personal email, a news article, or something else?
Ooh, that's a great question. My rule of thumb is that for every sort of financial request that we send out via an application, I suggest, 3 other touch points. Now, that could be a report with an article, that could be a phone call, that could be an email, but I think it's important to understand how the funder likes to be contacted, because I think that it's very different for government funders as opposed to family foundation, corporate, or private foundation. So I think that I would really understand how they want to be involved in the process, because other times, if it's a corporate funder, they might want to have a volunteer day with some of the other employees that they have. And so that could be a great way to have a touch point or a site visit. So it really just depends on the funder, because some might say, you know what, that one progress update email is enough. So I would say to understand your funders and to know what works for them.
Awesome. And Julia asked if there's a layman's version of 2 CFR 200.
Oh gosh. You know who has a book on it is Lucy Morgan, and a MyFed trainer, and she has really developed some wonderful trainings on the topic, and there's even a book that she wrote. So it's myfedtrainer.com, and there's information that can really help guide you through, because if you were to go on online and look up 2 CFR 200, it's just going to be a lot of jargon, and that's helpful to kind of understand if you're looking at a specific issue or topic area like matching funds or program income or something like that. But if you're trying to get a full sense of what's involved with 2 CFR 200, the internal controls, that's a great resource. National Grants Management Association does a training every year, and they have a conference. So that's another great way to learn more about it. There's some other specialized webinar trainings as well that they have once a month. And also, is it the Council of Financial? I have to look up the name, but they always provide updates on 2 CFR 200, and they have them available on their website where you can access these webinars on various different topics related to it.
Awesome. So Julia, if you're looking for some of those extra resources, Rachel's email is on the screen as well. I'm sure she'd be happy to share those along with you. If you have any other questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Also wanted to let folks know that I put that Freebies resource page in the Zoom chat. That's that subscribe page link. If you click in there, you'll be able to get access to the planning resource that Rachel shared, as well as a few of our resources. And then also, if you enjoyed this grant workshop, we'll be back in 2 weeks for project budgets, what to do and what not to do with Margaret President Fourier. But we also will be back tomorrow, where we will have a customer spotlight. So we're going to be sharing about how a director of giving raised $1 million in under a year on Instrumentl. So if you're curious about those, I'll leave the event calendar in the Zoom chat as well. But yeah, if you have any questions, I'll give it another minute or so to see if any new ones come in. I think we've covered most of the ones so far. Teresa asked, are there any tips for getting other staff on board to help with grant management?
Ooh. Yeah, so that can be a challenge, and this is why in the beginning, that's why the leadership buy-in is so important. And this goes without saying that, in order to get people involved, it really needs to be a culture of support. Because I've actually, had a client it was a COO that said compliance is not important. And this was a large healthcare association, which made me very nervous. And so when you have that kind of ethos, it's not going to be translated well when you're actually delivering the work, when you're actually trying to do the work of grants management. I love the book, Atomic Habits by James Clear, because it's about developing slow and steady and small incremental change into your daily work. So what I would want to think about is perhaps the first step is to have that initial kickoff call when you're thinking about your grants calendar for the year and thinking about, what the opportunities are that you want to pursue. And then in addition to that, if you can have a monthly grants meeting to kind of talk through the different opportunities that have been awarded and thinking about separating them into the different functions of financial, programmatic, and administrative, who has the role on each different component, and understanding why it's important. And this is where the training comes in as well. So I would say that those meetings and sort of identifying the reasons why compliance is important is because you don't want to end up on the Washington Post. And I've seen that happen. And it's not a good situation, especially if you receive government funding.
Awesome. And then another question was asked, do you have any ideas for templates or other easier data collection methods from program managers? One thought I would say before you answer, Rachel, is I think probably a simple Google form of sorts or some sort of form field would probably make input a lot easier than potentially having some sort of unwieldy spreadsheet that, might not have as high of adoption. So that might be something to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you're talking about, because chances are if you receive funding for similar programs, the outcomes are going to be very similar. So I would think about, from a program vantage, what information you're trying to collect, and those metrics, I think, kind of similar to what you were saying, Will, should be aligned. It could be a Google Doc, could be something simpler. It doesn't have to be extensive in order for it to at least be successful.
Well, I'm going to try to interpret this question from Krista. How to make an argument based on your organization's organization. I'm going to ask you to rephrase that question, Krista, but in the next question, Elsa, is the logic model to be done as a team, or is that something that the person over the program, that overseeing the program would complete?
I love that it could be a collective exercise, because the program lead would be great. And if there's anybody else who supports the program, because I think that it's important to get different vantage points. Now, the program side could definitely lead it, but it should definitely be reviewed by others, because there could be other things that might be missing or that could be built upon when you're doing that process.
Cool. Dora asked the question of how are you able to determine or research what foundations or grants are giving to new organizations? I think that's a question for me. The biggest thing that we do is we sift through all of the available public data from the IRS Business Master File, and we essentially cross-reference the differences between years. So whereas historically you might have gone through an old directory listing or a PDF file of the Form 990s and had to sift through that yourself, what we're doing is we are canonicalizing every single record and essentially comparing year by year who is a new grantee versus who is a repeat grantee and so on. And so that is how we are able to parse that sort of information. To my knowledge, there is no other tool out there that does that level of analysis in terms of figuring that out. But my general benchmark that I share with folks is if you can find folks where, you're looking for new funders and you find somebody who's giving 30% or more to new grantee, that's a really good funder typically to prioritize. And that's a very useful benchmark in general when it comes to, let's say you have 3 to 5 different opportunities on the table to pursue and you want to make the most of your time. So definitely look for that sort of metric, especially when you're creating that free account with Rachel's link, just because all of our free trials do have full access to the platform. They're not restricted in any way there. Nicole asked a question, do you have any resources to share with the leadership team about the importance of building a culture of compliance or accountability with funders?
Ooh. That's a great question. And I'm trying to think of resources that might be good. I'm wondering if the National Grants Management Association might have some information about why it's important to attend their conference. I know that the Grant Professionals Association does, because those are the kind of things I could see being brought to leadership's attention, just sort of why that kind of professional development is important. I think that kind of speaks to that sort of culture of compliance. And if you're talking about government grants, that's a non-issue because it's required in order to administer government funding. So I think that it depends on the type of funding you have, but that's where I would look to start. I don't have any resources at my fingertips, but if I do some digging, I could probably try to locate a couple things. So you can follow up with me separately if you want.
Awesome. And that email for Rachel is rachel@rbwstrategy.com. If you have any final questions, I'll give it a sec, but otherwise we are all caught up on questions so far.
Great. And I just wanted to thank everybody. I know that, as I said, compliance is sort of the broccoli of the grants world. So a lot of people don't want to talk about it, but I love talking about compliance. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and I'm happy to answer them, because I can dig in and I can get into 2 CFR 200 or not. So, let me know.
Awesome. And Diana just asked for my email. My email is will@instrumentl if you want to reach out to me. We will have this workshop replay sent out to you guys in the coming days. I will be hopping onto a flight, so I'll get to it later this week, but I promise I'll get it to you guys. And we will be back tomorrow, actually, Kimberly, for your question, in terms of the nonprofit that was able to secure $1 million in a year. So join us for our customer spotlight tomorrow, where we will feature that story. But other than that, thanks so much, everybody. I'm going to start working on getting this out to you guys and hope to see you at one of our future events. Bye all.